So if you will, good job, Micah. If you will turn to 1 Samuel chapter 21. Chapter 21 is 15 verses. It's the only chapter in 1 Samuel that we're going to be covering tonight. But we are going to be covering more than 15 verses for sure. Okay? So let's start right off with verse 1. It says, "Now David came to Nob." If you remember, David is kind of on the run right now. There's some things that are going on. We saw in last Wednesday with the last two chapters that David is kind of on the run from Saul. He just had some final chapter with his dear friend Jonathan, and he goes from Jonathan to Samuel, and now we have this priest, Ahimelech. And Ahimelech is, hang on one second. We didn't lose total power and stuff, right? Okay. So we're good. So Ahimelech is the first high priest that we have in Israel since Eli. And I don't know, it's been such a long time since we covered Eli, but Eli had the sons and things weren't going well, and there were prophecies that he was going to get cut off, and it was just not so good, right? Well, Ahimelech, he's this priest. He's the first one who is a relative to Eli. He's Eli's brother's descendant. The whole lineage of Eli is completely cut off, but the Lord has a plan to continue things. And so we have this person that gets this introduction here. And one of the things that I have as note for this is that we have people as our very first reference tonight for the things that the Lord is presenting and bringing to us. If we're following along, this is the third godly man that David is bouncing around to, right? He's got a lot of situations and a lot of people, a lot of circumstances, but he goes from his dear godly friend Jonathan to the godly prophet Samuel, and now we find him with another godly man. So he's just kind of like, you know those puddle jumper planes? He's just kind of doing the holy kind of puddle jumper situation, going from safe, godly person to safe, godly person. So we have him here at this place, and it kind of startles Ahimelech. And Ahimelech says, Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" So this kind of sets the stage for the scene here. David is here. He's alone. Yeah. Sorry, guys. Okay. So David just kind of waltzes into this area. And keep in mind, this is pre-temple, right? So with David still being on the scene, the temple does not come until his son Solomon. We're way, way, way pre-temple. What we have here is a mobile tabernacle, right? And so David comes into this space, and in this place, there's going to be a number of priests that get referenced in the next chapter. But right now, there's just this conversation. Ahimelech is like, "What's going on? What are you doing here? Why? What's the deal? What's the situation?" And here's what David says. David said to Ahimelech the priest in verse 2, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place.'" So this is the first reference. I'm going to shoot you guys as straight as possible, no matter who it is, some of the realities of imperfect men. And David is known as being a person who is a man after God's own heart, and yet at the same time, in this chapter, we just saw in this very verse, it says here, "The king has ordered me on some business." And the thing is, that's not true. That's lie number one. And then he says, "Do not let anyone know anything about the business." This is the quote from what David said the king said. "Don't let anyone know anything about the business in which I send you or what I have commanded you." And that's lie number two. So we have two lies that start off this chapter. And that's almost like, I'm telling you, this is an interesting chapter. It's kind of a weird chapter. And if I were to title this something, I would title it something along the lines of David's having a really bad day. A really bad day. Because David knows really well what it's like to face all kinds of adversity, right? Like massive giants that are men slayers, bears and lions and all kinds of things. But now we see something in this man that does not seem to reflect some of the other things that we know about David. So he says these things, and I have here as the second point, the second bulletin of observation here, accountability. And so I was reading this and I was putting some of this together, and it made me wonder if David was there with some of those men, who are like on Team David, right? Let's say it was Jonathan, let's say it was Samuel. Do we think David may have lied in the same way? But with David being all by himself, David can say whatever he wants to say without any of that accountability, and Ahimelech has no idea. He doesn't know. And so maybe accountability might have changed some of this situation a little bit. Maybe. There is one other scenario that I thought could very well play into this, and that is plausible deniability. So I don't know. So I'm just going to speculate a little bit. I do see what's a total lie here. This isn't true. But what if David was trying to protect Ahimelech and didn't want him to know what was going on because he didn't want him to have any kind of trouble giving him plausible deniability? It might be a little bit of a reach, but it crossed my mind. So I'm putting it out there. There's no way that Scripture is saying that this is what it is exactly, but I thought maybe. But as we look at the context of this chapter and what we're going to see, probably not likely, okay? So verse 3 says, David's continuing on, "Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found." David's getting a little bossy here. I think we know what that's like when we get hungry, right? When we haven't eaten in a while and things just come out and we didn't exactly mean for it to hit exactly the same way that it hit. But, there's this, that box right there on that word give. That's a command. So he's given him a command of what's going on. And the priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women." So there's some holy bread on site. And if these guys have kept themselves from women, then okay, maybe they can have the wonder bread. Well, what's this talking about? David answered and said to the priest, "Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out here, and the vessels of the young men are holy. And the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day." So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread. And I want to emphasize this word right here, showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. So here's how this worked. And because we're going to be covering a lot of different verses tonight, I figured I would just bring you guys up to speed on some of the law for this and then dive a little bit deeper in some other areas. So in regards to the law, it said that there would be this ritual that took place every 7 days. There would be 12 loaves of bread that were organized in 2 groups of 6. So 1 row of 6 plus frankincense, another row of 6 plus frankincense. And these would be offered before the Lord every 7 days. So on that 7th day, they would pull out the bread, they would add the new bread, and then it would be before the Lord for 7 days as a representation of the 12 tribes of Israel. In addition to this, I think I actually kept, so in Leviticus 22, that reference in regards to who can eat it, that came from Exodus. But then in Leviticus 22, it says, "Whatever man of the descendants of Aaron," so this is explicitly for Aaron and the priests, "who is a leper or who has discharge, shall not eat the holy offerings until he is clean. And whoever touches anything made unclean by a corpse, or a man who has had an emission of semen, or whoever touches any creeping thing by which he would be made unclean, or any person by whom he would become unclean, whatever his uncleanness may be, the person who has touched anything shall be unclean until evening, and shall not eat the holy offerings unless he washes his body with water. So we have this rule where it's like that bread is set apart for the Aaronic priesthood. Aaron and the descendants of Aaron, all the priests, that bread is for them. It's part of the ritual. No one else. But then on top of that, you can't take of that bread if you're unclean in some of these areas. So when David says, like, I need 5 loaves of bread, and Ahimelech says, well, the only bread we have is this bread. Are your men at least clean? Have they been with any women? Right? Because that's one of the qualifiers here. One of these things that would prevent the Aaronic priesthood from not being able to take part until they had cleansed themselves was that emission of semen. So they're asking, like, all right, are your guys at least good in this area? And David says, yes, we are. But there's other facets here to talk about. And one of those things has to do with the Sabbath, because this bread was offered on the Sabbath, okay? So this is going to, I don't know if you guys know, the very first reference to the word Sabbath, the very, very, very first one. It's not in Genesis 1. The word is not used in reference to God resting. It doesn't pop up until we're dealing with the situation of manna, which is in Exodus 16. So this is the very first reference. It says, then God said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a Sabbath rest. That right there, first occurrence in the Bible. A holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. So if you remember, when it came to the manna, 6 days they could go out and they could gather. But then there was this one day, and this is the first time this is referenced as that day that is going to be set apart not to collect manna. Before this is given, there is never anything that is said about what to do or what not to do on the Sabbath. This is number one. The second occurrence of this word, Sabbath, comes from the 10 Commandments. So in the 10 Commandments, which I'm going to just preface this by saying, if this is new to you guys, this is a pretty big deal. The 10 Commandments are really high up there of importance, okay? So for this to have the number 2 mention get dropped here, this is something that will start to set the tone of the culture for the Israelites going forward in very interesting ways. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Commandment number 1. You shall have no other gods before me. Commandment number 2, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath, for you shall bow down to them. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, visiting to the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. That was number 3. Number 4, that was number 2. Number 3 is you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And then number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. This is our first mass corporate instruction that becomes codified as part of the law. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, made it holy. That's a lot that's covered there that the Lord is trying to make clear. And by comparison, let's look at the other commandments. We're already nearly halfway there, right? Let's just mosey on down to number 5. Number 5 is honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. That's a promise that's included with that, right? That your days may be long. And then we get to number 6. You shall not murder. And that's all that's said. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's. Oh. You know how sometimes people say if the Bible repeats itself, it's trying to get some attention, right? Well, I had to look at the 10 commandments and go, what is the Lord trying to say where one of the commandments is just a few words? You shall not steal. And some of these others, the Lord is I'm going to have to really, really address this. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, female servant, his ox, his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, something that I love about our faith and our walk and helping and training people up and everything is when you share something that is from the Lord with another person. You share a verse with them or something, and the Lord speaks to them in it. And it just kind of hits them. And it's whoa, that's me. And I can't help but think that some of this stuff here isn't necessarily future, I'm going to have to say this because it's going to happen someday. I think it covers that as well. But I think also the Lord might just be pointing out the things that people had to take a step back and realize. I've been checking out my neighbor's ox a little bit too much. Have you seen the horsepower on that thing? That is, whew. And so I think the Lord is just really kind of bringing some things to light that are important. But keep in mind, 10 commandments, right? This is big, big time. And so we get into setting the stage and the context for Jesus dealing with what happens many, many, many years later as the culture continues and continues and continues. Because what it says here, for the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, and the 7th day is a Sabbath. In it you shall do no work. Well, what exactly does that mean? What do you mean no work? What does that mean? And this is where it gets a little squirrely. And I think some of these things are easy. Don't steal. Just don't, right? That's easy. But on something like this, a lot of other things have developed, and what we see culture that doesn't necessarily reflect God start to become what reflects the people of God and the religion that they're calling Judaism. And some of these same mistakes that are just based on culture, not what the Lord intended, still continue on. And continue on and continue on. I don't have this reference here, but take a look at Colossians. Take a look at Colossians 2 and 3 and look at what it talks about in regards to the laws of man. But right now we're going to talk about number 3, Jesus being the Lord of the Sabbath. Because interestingly enough, everything that we just read about in regards to David and Ahimelech goes center stage now in the gospel. For the Lord to show us and give us an idea of what the law was meant for, what it was about. So, and something you'll notice also, if you're really paying attention, this is covered in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what I like to do is I like to pull from the verses that I feel really bring out the story with the most amount of detail. So you'll see me jump around here, so just pay attention to the screen. We're going to start with Luke chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "Now it happened on the second Sabbath, after the first, that he went through the grain fields, and his disciple plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands." Now, this is a little bit foreign to us, but think about peanuts, right? So pistachio nuts, something like that. You gotta work a little bit there, to get to that kernel. And that's what they were doing. They're kind of going around. They're just kind of grabbing some stuff and to get some grain. The response to this is, when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." It says don't do any work, right? Jesus answered them, saying, "Have you not even read this? What David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him." So we know Jesus has a retort, and he's like, man, I don't know if you guys know what the Bible says, right? Like, you're coming at me like this is wrong. Your disciples are doing this all wrong. They're violating the Sabbath. And the Lord is like, are you familiar with this? And here's the point I want to draw from here. It's the word hills, which represent the hills that we want to die on sometimes, which is what I really think that Jesus is doing with the Pharisees. So in regards to the Pharisees, they're having an argument with God about him being wrong, right? Like, that's just the reality. And as much as I want to go, ha, 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 I can't but help think of how many times I have probably said, this isn't right, God. Something here is not right. Like, this is what the word says. And one of the cool things I'll tell you guys about this, there's an expression, caught, not taught. And in regards to this chapter, and also what we're going to be looking at in the Gospels and how Jesus addressed this stuff, there are some black and white things in here that I've always known, and I would always teach it the biblical sound way that Jesus presented it and taught it and everything. But there's always probably a little part of me that was always like, but there was this violation, right? Like, you're not supposed to do anything. What does any work actually mean? So when it comes to correcting God, we got to realize, when it comes to like this is my sacred cow. This is what's important to me. Jesus was really about, if you can think about Jesus in his ministry, he was really about tearing down sacred cows that were not truly sacred. He was really about changing and fighting against the culture that would be really just putting people in bondage and robbing them of what was true and meant for good. So he's like, are you not familiar with this? Mark 2:26 says, how he went to the house of God, talking about David, how David went to the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. So I want you guys to think about this for a second. Jesus is referencing, as a proof text for what they're doing, a person who broke the law. Like, are you guys not familiar with this? You're not familiar with how David broke the law? Does this bring justification? Is it like, I'm using the two wrong rule? Like, you guys should know. Haven't you read the Bible? Two wrongs make a right. So if that's not what he's saying, what is he saying? What is the Lord saying with this? He brings up a person who's breaking the law. Matthew 12:5, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? And I'll just tell you guys right now, that's one of those verses where, like, you're reading it and you're just kind of like, check, okay, I'm with you, keep reading. But if you have to teach it, trust me, you got to dig a little bit more in that one, all right? So let's examine that for just a second. Jesus is saying, the priests were profaning the Sabbath and blameless. What could that mean? So earlier we went over how on the Sabbath you weren't supposed to do work. Well, guess who works on the Sabbath? The priests, right? Guess who's doing a lot of work on the Sabbath? It's the priests. So the priests were the ones who were over there, like, guys, not even just sacrifices, but making the fire at least. Like, that's a lot more than doing this and getting some kernels, right? The priests were putting in the work on the Sabbath. Like, you guys have off on Sunday. I don't have off on Sunday. Right? That's Super Bowl day. That's a big day here with doing ministry and stuff, and it's good, right? Like, I have another time of rest in my week, but Sunday is like, that's go time. I'm up early. I'm at church at 7:30, and we're going. We're using some gears and everything. It's good work. It's holy work. And the priests were doing holy work. So he says in verse 6, yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. So these were the temple workers, and it was holy and it was good. It wasn't to be blamed. And there's one here who's before you who's greater than the temple itself. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And one of the references I have here, which I think we talked about this like last week, but if you had known, that word there is the word gnosko. And remember how I was just talking about like there's taught and then there's caught. And I'm really familiar with this whole story and navigating through some of the challenges of it and some of the nuances of it. I'm really familiar with this. But the cool thing is, as I was studying for this one this week, it was like that aha moment, like, oh my gosh, this is what Jesus is talking about. And it was just so good, super caught. It was gnosko. I understood. I had familiarity with it. I knew it, right? And Jesus is saying, if you had known what this means, if you knew it, not just information, but if you really knew, then you would understand that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And that's pulled from Hosea chapter 6. Some things took precedence over the Sabbath's observance, like temple rituals and saving a life even. Defensive warfare, right? When they had these wars, were they like, no work today, no work today? Like there were other things that were going on. I like this quote by Guzik. He says, at this time, God's people were still good at bringing the sacrifice. That's what it's referencing in Hosea 5:6, but they had forsaken mercy. And they abandoned mercy because they gave up on the knowledge of God and truth. So yeah, the practice has been corrupted because they just don't know. They don't gnosko what the Lord is about and what his heart is, what the why is for these things. God would rather have right hearts full of truth and mercy than sacrifice. I think that's a great quote that really brings it home. And Jesus is pointing this out. If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned these who are not guilty. And now verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. What does that mean? Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Like God intended, here's something that's cool. And again, this is just like the Lord just pulling something on the fly. So I don't have the reference off the top of my head. But his laws are not burdensome, right? The things that the Lord has set up for us, we should not count and look at as curses. If the Lord wants us to be holy, that's not a burden for us. So we have the Sabbath, and it's like, oh, what a bummer. I can't do these things on the Sabbath. But it was never intended that we should be enslaved and just shackled to the Sabbath like a ball and chain. What the Lord is saying is, I made this for good for you. I made this for your well-being. And with that, I want to look at Galatians, starting with verse 23, chapter 3, verse 23. But before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law. So the law had a purpose. It had, and this effectual plan from the Lord to safeguard, to lead, and protect his people. Kept for the faith which would afterward be revealed. Therefore, the law was our, let's go bigger here, tutor, to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by following it, by faith. Not that we should become more and more and more familiar with the law. Not that we should really get our memory verses down with the law, but that the law would bring us to the Lord and that we would be justified by faith. After faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. So here's my question. Did God intend for the law for good for us? Man was not made for Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. I would say that the law wasn't made so that man could follow the law, but the law was made for the well-being of man. And this is exactly what Paul's laying out here. It's there to lead you and to bring you to justification by faith. It had this role as an instructor for you. It's for your benefit. Then he goes on to say, back to Matthew 12, what man is there among you who has sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Therefore, big conclusion, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So, this brings up number 5, letter versus spirit. I found this commentary, and I thought it was great. And so I'm going to read it to you guys. I warn you, it's a little bit humorous, so try not to go to sleep. Ready? The spirit of the law is often contrasted to the letter of the law. In that context, the spirit of the law has to do with the deeper meaning of or reason for the law, whereas the letter of the law refers to exact wording, literally applied without regard for any deeper meaning. Children are good at emphasizing the letter of the law to the exclusion of the spirit of it. The following example may help. A child comes home from school and is told, do not watch TV until you finish your homework. A few minutes later, his mother finds him watching cartoons on his tablet with his homework untouched. The child protests that his mom only told him not to watch TV. She never said anything about watching cartoons on a tablet. Check one for the kid, right? Like, true. In this example, the child has kept the letter of the law, but has violated the spirit of the law. If the mother had said, finish your homework before you watch cartoons, then perhaps the child would have watched a baseball game instead. Once again, keeping the letter of the law. She could have been even more specific. Do not watch any kind of show on any electronic device until you finish your homework, but then the child might decide to go outside and play, leaving his unfinished homework inside. The frustrated mom could have said, don't do anything until you finish your homework. But the child, taking it literally, could then claim to be unable to open his book bag to get his homework. Obviously, focusing on the letter of the law can be a tactic to negate the intent or spirit of the law. I was that kid, so I really get this, right? Like, we're following black and white on some things here, but we're missing the heart of this. And so that makes us kind of like ask that question, like, Lord, these things that are hard for me. And guys, it could be anything. It could be anything. It could be prayer. Maybe prayer is hard. Maybe prayer is like, I don't want to. I don't like this part. If I'm being really honest and not telling anybody else at church and everything, I don't like doing this. Or maybe it's like reading the word. Or maybe it's coming to church on services. Maybe it's struggles with lust. Whatever it is, Lord, why am I having a hard time with this? Why is this law here? Why is this regulation here? What is your heart about this matter for me? Instead of just thinking from our flesh and our wants and our desires, or the things that are even just hard, into what the Lord is doing to make us holy. It's a very different thing. And to understand and to hear the heart of God, like, Lord, why? Not why I'm questioning you, but why isn't help me understand. Because Jesus was breaking down some knowledge here with the Pharisees, and I think it's lost on them. So, moving along here, we are really doing an interesting dip. This is my biggest detour I have ever done, and we're not even close to being done yet. Matthew 22:35, then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law? Greatest commandment. Which one of these things of all the laws? And he's trying to trap him in this, right? And Jesus says to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And I like how Jesus referenced that word for hang. and especially all. So what's the connecting factor here? I would say it's the two words that I clearly pointed out and highlighted, made bold and underlined. That'd be my case. And that word is love. You shall love the Lord. You shall love your neighbor. What is he trying to say to me here? What is the spirit of this law now? And this is where we come to the section, bullet point number 6. What does love do? Because when David is in this situation, and he goes to the temple, and the high priest is saying, well, we've only got this one kind of bread that you're not supposed to have. The question is, what does love do? What does love do? When we have a situation where a person might come into our church with needs, never seen the person before. Actually, let me up the ante. Let me just up the ante here. Let's say the person comes into our church and has needs and is making those needs clear and everything, and at the same time the person is in a certain form of stupor, like drunkenness, or maybe they're on fentanyl, or something like that. The question is, what does love do? And I'm going to break down love here real quick too, because I don't want there to be a misunderstanding here. So I was having a conversation with Patrick up in CC Wichita, and this is one, like this what does love do? I've heard him say that before. Like they have a mission statement sort of a thing, quote, I'm butchering it, but it's kind of the Calvary Chapel one, which is win, build, send. Like that's what we do. We win people to the gospel. We build them up, equip them, and edify them. We send them into the world, into their place of work, into their homes. We send them out to infect the world with the goodness of God, the grace and mercy of God, the gospel of God. Having plugged their church enough, one of the things he also says nearly as much as that doesn't make it to the t-shirt of Will and Build Send, is he says all the time, what does love do? What does love look like here? And I actually tried to say, like, well, which is it? Is it this? Is it this? He said, it depends. It depends on the situation and the circumstances. I'm not going to just, like, tell you it's only this, because love is contextual, not sentimental. This is important. Because, like, so, for example, let's say the person comes in, and let's say that they're on something, some sort of substance, right? Love isn't just, can I do whatever you want me to do for you? That's not what love is. I mean, come on, we've got parents in this room, right? We've had children. We know that's not what love is. I want ice cream. Not interested. Eat your green beans. Because I love you, right? It's not because I made them purposely because you don't like them as a form of punishment. I'm telling you this because I love you. So conversation I had in the past, Justin Alfred, I was talking to him about this word agape, and you know, he was getting very animated, and he was getting very excited, and he was saying, what if we understood agape as the most powerful form of love, one that is a motive to the effect of compulsion, an assent of the will leading to joy and satisfaction. So it's kind of like agape drives, right? It drives me to do the things that are sacrificial. It drives me to do the things that are caring. And so, like, while we were on the phone, we kind of came up with this definition: a desire and pursuit of sincere and intense conviction, having great concern, even painful suspense, to help at any cost and sacrifice to ourselves for the well-being of the beloved. And that's a big qualifier, because what might really be a well-being may not be what they think is a well-being, right? The Lord disciplines those who he loves for their well-being. So love isn't sentimental. It is contextual. It depends on the situation and the circumstances. And of course, there should be consistency completely and repletely with the Word of God 1 Corinthians 13 and on and on. So many things that we see in regard to how the word shows us love. And my goodness, the gospel, Jesus shows us love much more than he uses the word agape. Shows us love, lives love. And so that's why I think that this idea, like this for me right here, this is the nucleus of tonight. What does love do? I think this is so much the nucleus that Jesus is like, this is a trump card, guys. Like, don't you remember the story of David and how he unlawfully ate this bread, but it was good because it was love and it was done out of love. And you know, I confess often my black and whiteness, right? And so that's why, like, those letters being up there in rainbow, like that's how I usually do my bullet points to like really bring it up. But guys, I'm telling you, this for me brought color to that black and white so significantly and made me just go, oh, I'm so on board. I'm so on board, because I used to have trouble with the technicality of that. I used to have trouble with some of the things where it's like, but it is a violation, but it does break the law. And I was talking to my wife about this, and it's like, my degree is in criminal justice, and I studied criminal law and things like that. And so, like, I have to get away from my old thinking, and I have to get on board with the Lord. And I don't think I'm the only person, right? Like, we all have to do that. We have to get away from the nature of our thoughts and the direction of which we think things, just like the Pharisees were dying on that hill. And we have to be students and disciples of Jesus for him to teach us. And so, yeah, Jesus is like, do you guys know 1 Samuel 21? Because we're going over it tonight. And so this is the heart of everything here. This is what I think we can ask ourselves for the rest of our life, every single day, for all kinds of situations that we face. What does love do? And keep in mind, like, huge caveat, contextual, not sentimental. Contextual. Love may not be giving that person money because they need it. It may not be. Love may be giving your house to somebody who didn't even ask for it because you were following the Lord and this is what he was leading, right? It's contextual. It's following the Lord, and it's keeping in step with what the word is saying. So that's my big, off the beaten trail, following all kinds of things. Back to 1 Samuel 21, verse 7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And I'm just going to tell you guys this as a little spoiler for next week kind of a thing. I really, really, really don't like this guy. And I'm not even joking here. I have a big, big problem with this guy. Next chapter breaks my heart, and I'm just going to leave it there. Maybe you guys will read ahead and check things out. I have a hard time reading chapter 22 and holding it together. I'm just going to say that. So David said to Ahimelech, "Is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." And I have a reference there that says L3. And it's not a reference to a bone or something. This L3 is his third lie here in this chapter. I didn't bring anything because the king has me on this hasty mission. So, the priest said, and I just want you guys to, like, I think you guys know when I study, like, I listen to some music. And I listen to some interesting music. There's not lyrics. I listen to some just environmental, instrumental, ambient, sort of like big, big things. And I'm listening to this while I'm going through this. And the music was big here, okay? The music was big. And it says, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, take it, for there is no other except that one." I still have goosebumps when I go over that, right? Because he's on the run. Is there any sword in the house? Is there any weapon in the house? I'll take a slingshot. Like, do you have anything? Well, we do happen to have this one thing here, David. And David said, "There is none like it, give it to me." And all I could say to that is provisions based on faithfulness. Like the reason why that sword was there is because David was faithful to take care of business earlier. And he didn't know he was going to need it. He didn't know when it was going to be needed. He didn't know how that was going to play out. But here he is. Now he's on the run. And all of a sudden, the Lord is providing. Because he had already taken care of business. Because he was faithful already. And so now we move on to the rest of the story. And again, this is a doozy. Verse 10, "Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s?' Now David took these words to heart, and he was very much afraid of Achish the king of Gath." So this is where things really just split into a different direction. And I don't know what else to call it except for a real head scratcher here. Because remember, the very first thing I pointed out were people, godly men. Jonathan, Samuel, Ahimelech. Now, Gath. Now, Achish, king of Gath. Do you guys know where Goliath is from? It's Gath. What is it? How big do you guys think that David is at this point? Like, I want you to just imagine his stature. Forget what he looks like in Florence. He's not 20 feet tall, right? Think about what he actually might look like height-wise as a boy. Because keep in mind, his brothers are up there in age. They got to be probably 20 plus years old. Because there's a reference in, I think it's Numbers, where it says that if take a census and if they're 20 years old and older, that they are to be for the armies of Israel. And David's not part of the army. He's a lad. He's a boy. Well, how big is this sword? What does that sword look like? And David's walking into Gath. Do you think anybody notices? Does anyone pick up on what this kid is carrying? This is not going to land with a lot of you guys, but he's got to look like Cloud from Final Fantasy VII with just this massive, what is this? Huge. And so they're like, this is, not only do they reference him as David, but the king of the land. And so, one of the points that I have here is reputation. What is the reputation that we have that goes before us? Because David's reputation was very clear. They knew who this guy was. They knew his calling. And we all have a reputation that does precede us. And one thing I'll say on this note, no names, we're not going to use any names, but I know a man who does not do so well with hospitals and doctors. And after a certain amount of time, as he needed to get continual aid, he developed a certain reputation with a title of noncompliance. And from henceforth, once that's on file, it makes things complicated. Then they start Mr. So-and-so, oh, one of those. And it's hard to sometimes walk back from that. And we can't do anything to change anybody's mind for anything, but what we can do is we can change our mind. That person could change his mind from being non-compliant, right? Can change his mind, can pivot and turn from how that was and be like, I used to be this way, but that's not the way I'm going to be anymore. And so the reputations absolutely are not what should be defining us or our identity. All I'm simply saying is we do have them. We do. Everybody in this room, we have reputations. And they do go before us. And it's going to be characteristic of how we carry ourselves. So, this other part here. Now, David took these words to heart. And because he took these words to heart, What it says here is he was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And that's another reference I have here. Heart, and what is it that we take to heart? What ends up landing, basically? So I just want to reference, we are supposed to take our thoughts captive, right? We are not supposed to be led by fear. We are not supposed to be led by emotions. We are supposed to be led by what? Come on, you guys sound like Sunday morning right now. You guys are supposed to be led by what? The Word, the Spirit of God, God. Like, I'll take all those things. We're supposed to be led by a particular thing, but not by these other things. We have to be careful what lands on our heart. We have to be careful what we take to heart. Because from this moment, David becomes much afraid. That's not the same David that I read about just a little while ago. But now he is, because he took these things to heart. Like, one of the things, like with the whole tri-perspectivalism thing, like, there's a lot of things that didn't make sense. We have a boy who's going to go out to war against a giant, against a warrior of warriors, and he's going to go out there fearlessly because he knew who God was. And that's not what we're seeing here. Something changes. And this happens to the best of us, right? Like, we've got our heads screwed on straight. We've got our memory verses. We've got that stuff where it's like, that's my life verse. But then some kind of situation and circumstance lands. And it's not supposed to. We were supposed to take it captive. And the enemy just starts doing some things and changing our disposition, changing what we were supposed to be grounded on and growing from. Now we have David who's afraid. That does not describe the man that I would think of. Verse 13, so there's still nothing I could do. I can't teach this. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. You teach that. What am I supposed to? Actually, I don't even know what this arrow is pointing to. At this point, I'm completely dumbfounded where we go from here. Yes. Counterfeit. So David was changing who he was for others around him. This is not David. This is not who he is. In fact, what it says here is pretending. He pretended madness, right? This isn't who he is, but this is what he's resorting to. Verse 14, then Achish said to his servants, look, you see, the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So the king of Gath, he's kind of like me in some way. Like, what do you want me to do with this? This guy's crazy. And that brings us to our last point here, and that is the 10-year plan. The 10-year plan. Numbers 1, this is that reference from earlier. Take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families, by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually, from 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies. So David's got to be under 20. And I was looking at some sources, and some say between 8 and 15 was the beginning stage, somewhere in there. Like when he gets anointed by Samuel, somewhere between 8 and 15. And then later on, when he takes the head of Goliath, a little bit older. I think it actually references a beard, right? Probably not an 8-year-old, could be things, but probably older. So let's say 18, 19, somewhere in there, right? 2 Samuel 5:4 says David was 30 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 40 years. So here's what the Lord's bringing to mind for me in this. Here's what I'm seeing in this. Sometimes the Lord has a 10-year plan. And we didn't know it was going to be a 10-year plan. And we're signed up for 1 year. And we're like, here's how I think this needs to happen. But we didn't realize it was supposed to be a longer time frame. We didn't realize it was supposed to be, this is going to be enduring. This is going to be different. This is not a quick fix. And what I see with David here is making a quick fix and doing some brash things that are so uncharacteristic for the other things that we see of David. However, this is where we're going to close. We're going to close with Psalm 34:1, because check this out. It says, a psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech. This is right here, right now. This can't be more relevant. So come on, I got to read this. It's so exciting. And I'm not going to, well, maybe I'm going to read the whole verse. How are we doing? We're under 2 hours. I will bless the Lord at all times. That's our starting point. So like, this is the context I want to give you guys. David goes into Gath, big old chunky sword, bigger than maybe the boy, clearly obvious. They're rounding him up, taking him to the king. He's like, I'm going to, like, actually some commentaries even said, like, this is possibly epilepsy. I know epilepsy. This is not epilepsy, okay? This is just pretending madness. And I think what happened was David's like, that worked? This should not have worked. This is the Lord. Like that's the context that I see this being written in. I can't make any sense of this that would not be that. I will bless the Lord at all times. I will praise, his praise shall continually be in my mouth. Like whereas spittle was just coming out of my mouth, his praise is going to be in my mouth. And guys, we never see that again from David. We never see this behavior ever again. He's not like with Abraham, like he does this little like I'm going to lie to Pharaoh real quick and get out of this one. And then he does it again. And it's like, come on. We don't see that with David. He doesn't return to this. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. My soul shall make its boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear of it and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all of my fears. And there I have, he's protected. He has this sword, but the Lord does not use, like one of the things that the priest says is the sword of Goliath. There is nothing like it. And we've seen crazy things with some mighty men. We've seen some mighty men who slay all kinds of numbers and everything. Like whether we're talking about Judges and Gideon or David's mighty men that are going to come in the next book, we could have had wow, the perfect scenario, a mighty man with a mighty, mighty sword in helicopter mode, just taking out all of this whole territory. And in what we do have, in fact, is that the sword is not what delivers David. Though there's nothing like it, that sword is not what delivers him. He heard me and delivered me from all my fears. Boy, don't we need to hear that. This is one of those things where it's, Lord, what are my fears that I'm trying to wield and deal with on my own instead of you being my deliverer? They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried out, and the Lord heard him and saved him of all his troubles. He's talking about himself. The Lord heard me, and he saved me from everything. I'm not going to spoil. Psalm 34 has a number more verses, and they are glorious and wonderful, but we're going to stop there. We're going to pray. I'm going to invite Debbie and James up for some worship. So you guys come on up, and let's go before the Lord and close this out. A glimpse of a very bad day for David. And he really has his head on straight in that psalm. Lord, thank you for the example of David, his quick repentance, the heart of this man that is trying to figure out a challenging decade of his life that is going from cave to mountain to distant and foreign land. But Lord, my prayer is that you show us what we're supposed to see here. My prayer is to show us that how sometimes we might act a fool and it has nothing to do with your plan, but you were still good anyway. You still blessed us anyway. And for us to get back and right with our standing and our trust in you instead of madness, instead of silliness. Show us what that is. Show us what you're calling us to. Show us where we need to stand fast and stand strong in these things. In Jesus' name, amen.